Imagine stepping through a doorway into a crowded room 12,000 years ago. No soap, no deodorant, no daily shower. Dozens of unwashed bodies, animal hides, Woodsmoke, and the heavy mineral smell of unwashed skin, all trapped together in close quarters. Your modern nose would probably recoil instantly. Here's the part that should surprise you. The people standing in that room might not have smelled it the way you would. Not because they had worse hygiene standards. Because some of their relatives, the Neanderthals and Denisovans whose genes still echo faintly inside modern humans today, may have had noses that were biologically less sensitive to exactly the smells you'd find most unbearable. Scientists recently found a way to prove this. And the method they use sounds like something out of science fiction. They built working, functional noses from species that have been extinct for tens of thousands of years. To understand how strange this discovery is, you first need to understand what your sense of smell actually is at a biological level. Every odor you've ever noticed begins with a molecule drifting into your nose and locking onto a specific protein called an olfactory receptor. Embedded in the lining of your nasal passage, you have hundreds of different receptor types, each tuned to detect particular categories of molecules. The specific set of receptors you carry, encoded directly in your DNA, determines which smells you can detect strongly, which you barely notice, and which you can't perceive at all. This means smell isn't a fixed, universal sense the way people often assume. It's genetically variable, person to person, and crucially for this story, species to species. Researchers Claire Demarche at University Paris-Saclay and Hiroki Matsunami at Duke University set out to test something nobody had ever directly measured before. What did smell feel like to a Neanderthal or a Denisovan? Not metaphorically. Literally, at the level of individual molecules locking onto individual receptors. Their method was remarkable, using databases of ancient DNA, including genetic material recovered through techniques pioneered by Nobel Prize-winning geneticist Svante Pääbo. The team identified the exact genetic sequences for olfactory receptors carried by Neanderthals and Denisovans. Then, instead of simply reading the genetic code and guessing what it might do, they synthesized those ancient genes and inserted them into living cells in a laboratory dish, essentially building tiny, functional pieces of a nose that no living creature has had in tens of thousands of years. Then they exposed those resurrected receptors to real odor molecules and measured exactly how they responded. One researcher on related work described the feeling of this experiment perfectly. It reproduced an event that hadn't happened since these species went extinct. An ancient odorant receptor responding to a smell on a lab bench for the first time in tens of thousands of years. What they found rewrites a few assumptions people tend to make about primitive versus modern senses. For the most part, Neanderthal and Denisovan receptors detected the same basic categories of smell that modern humans do. Smell, broadly, didn't have to be reinvented from scratch. But the sensitivity to specific smells varied dramatically between the three groups, and not always in the direction you'd expect. Neanderthal specific receptors turned out to be significantly less sensitive to spicy, sweet, minty, and floral smells compared to modern humans. If you handed a Neanderthal and a modern human the same flower, the modern nose would likely register something far more vivid and fragrant. In a sense, by this narrow measure, the modern human sense of smell is the more refined one, at least for certain categories. But here's where the story flips. Those same Neanderthal receptors were also notably less sensitive to the smell of sweat and urine. Specifically, less responsive to a compound called androstenedione, a steroid associated with body odor. Researchers studying Neanderthal remains, including specimens from Chagyrskaya Cave in Siberia, found this same reduced sensitivity consistently. And when you consider how Neanderthals actually lived, this detail starts to look less like a flaw and more like a strange kind of advantage. Neanderthal populations frequently sheltered in caves for extended periods, particularly during the brutal stretches of glacial maximums, when ice sheets expanded and the outside world became close to uninhabitable. Picture an extended family group confined to a single enclosed cave system for weeks at a time, with no running water, no soap, no ventilation beyond what the cave itself provided. Researcher Mary Margaret Hoover at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who worked on related research into ancient olfaction, suggested that a nose less sensitive to the smell of unwashed bodies could have been genuinely useful in exactly this kind of environment. Less distraction, less discomfort, in conditions you simply couldn't escape. In other words, a worse sense of smell by modern standards might have functioned as a quiet survival adaptation, tuned by evolution to make close quarters cave living tolerable for a species that often had nowhere else to go. Denisovans told an even stranger story. Their receptors differed from both Neanderthals and modern humans in broader, more unexpected ways. They were measurably less sensitive to floral scents, similar to Neanderthals, but far more sensitive in other categories, roughly 4 times more responsive to sulfurous smells, and 3 times more sensitive to balsamic, thick, resinous scents than modern humans are today. Researchers studying Denisovan biology have suggested this olfactory profile may connect to the diverse and sometimes extreme environments Denisovan populations are believed to have inhabited, from Siberian cold to environments much further south and east. None of these differences appear to have been accidental. As one of the researchers on this line of work put it, animals evolve olfactory receptors specifically to maximize their ability to find food and navigate their environment. And humans, unusually, eat an enormous range of different things, which may be part of why our own smell receptors ended up so broadly tuned, rather than narrowly specialized, the way many other animals' senses are. Which brings the story back to that crowded ancient room. If you actually traveled back 12,000 years and stepped inside it, the overwhelming, unbearable wall of odor you'd expect to hit you might genuinely have been less overwhelming to the people standing beside you. Not because their world was less smelly, but because their biology was quietly built, generation after generation, to filter a slightly different version of reality through their nose than the one filtering through yours right now. Every time you walk into a room and immediately register a smell someone else seems completely unbothered by you're experiencing a tiny, modern echo of exactly this same principle. Reality doesn't arrive at your senses as a single, objective truth. It arrives already filtered through millions of years of inherited biological choices, made by ancestors you'll never meet, solving problems you'll never personally face, written